Hey, is everybody caught up on the reading here? We're all doing good? It's okay if you're not. It is. You don't have to be completely caught up. Yeah, I thought I saw the am I missing somebody? I don't know. I thought I saw Mike and Jacqueline in here.
Down there, Michael, Jacqueline. Oh, now they're there.
Okay. I don't have them all in the same
Because you're on the phone.
I'm on the iPad, so I'm not going to be able to identify who's raising their hands or whatever. So I'd like to again start. Is there questions about last week or the reading this week that anybody wants to start with? Any questions whatsoever? All right. Then let's look at starting with the interpretation of the two dreams that Joseph had of the prison. So there's a cupbearer and the baker, and some of you will already know this, but just in case you don't, those two roles are pretty important roles in ancient kingdoms to try and protect the king from being any king or lord from being poisoned, okay, from assassination. So the cupbearer would actually drink a portion of the wine before a king or pharaoh would drink it, so that it would prove that it wasn't poisoned. So his life was on the line every drink. And the baker was in charge to make sure all the food wasn't poisoned. So therefore, many scholars believe, and it is a good possibility, that they were in prison because of a threat to the pharaoh's life, and that those two could have been part of a plot to assassinate the pharaoh. So they had gone to prison. One was exonerated and brought back to his position. The other one was not. All right. And so that means that probably the baker was the one that was probably not going back. Their dreams were just interpreted by Joseph, and he tells the bear to make sure he brings him up to the pharaoh, which he doesn't. And I said this last week, I think, in the message, that it's really a good thing that he didn't, because if he did and Joseph was let out of prison early, he probably would have gone back to Canaan and his family would have been starving to death. So God actually kept him in prison, which is not what we'd be praying for. You know, that when we're in prison, our first prayer would be, God, get me out of here, not God, I don't know why you've got me here. I hope that, this is all part of your plan. Eventually I get to know what that plan is. But most of the time we would just want out, right? Wouldn't you agree? So, and that's where Joseph is. He just wants to get let out. All right. And then let me see here. Ancient dreams. This was interesting to read. The ancient dreams, they had dream books where they actually kind of were. I already knew that they were serious about dreams in ancient times. But what I didn't know, that they would catalog dreams and then see what happened and see the symbols to see what happened after these dreams, to start assigning meaning to dreams based upon what happened afterwards. And so they were called dream books. And they had lots of them in the ancient world. Joseph would not have had access to any of those dream books, though. So carrying something on your head, like fruit on your head, would be a symbol of sorrow. That's one of the things they had saw as a regular symbol of sorrow. So when Joseph interprets the baker's dream, he's definitely got a reason to sorrow. His head's going to be lifted off his body. And so it's interesting that it is in conjunction with the way that people would interpret dreams anyway back then, but he did not have access to those books. He's a prisoner, right? And so his interpretation of dreams isn't based upon scientific research of the day or the process of elimination where they're trying to figure out what symbols mean. He would have determined, he said the answers come from God, and he was pretty clear about that when he said that. The other thing that's interesting is that it says on Pharaoh's birthday the cupbearer was released and the other one was killed. At this time, it wasn't so much birthday, it's much later in the Greek Empire time, the pharaohs would actually give amnesty to people on their birthday. But it could have been, they would do it in his time. In the time that Joseph was here, pharaohs would do that on the anniversary of them ascending the throne, becoming a pharaoh, which could be a birth because they saw themselves as a god from that day on. It could have been that way, but it is not uncommon for them to give amnesty to prisoners on their birthday. So the historical significance of those details actually are confirmed by the reality what actually happened in those ancient times. And then we have Pharaoh's 2 dreams, right? Usually dreams, like if bad things happen, and we do the same thing as Christians, if bad things are happening in your life, how many of you guys go, God, what did I do wrong? No hands? Yeah, we think, what did I do wrong, right? If bad things are happening, what did I do wrong? And if good things are happening, we think God must be happy with us, right? And in the ancient times, when they had dreams that were ominous or bad, they thought they had displeased the gods. Or if something good was happening, they had pleased the gods. It is an unusual set of dreams where Joseph's dreams have good and bad, and it has nothing to do with the pleasure or the displeasure of God. It just is, he is saying, this is going to happen. And dreams that happen twice, those dream books say this as well, when there are 2 dreams that are similar, it is fixed. The ancient believed that those things were not, that was a pretty sure thing that dream was going to happen. Whatever the results or whatever those symbols meant was really going to happen. And Joseph says the same thing. Since it's 2, this is fixed, it's not changing. And so then he puts together a plan or advises him on a plan. And this is really interesting too. Famine in Egypt is extremely rare. Anybody want to guess why?
Nile River?
Yes, the Nile River. So the Nile River it flooded seasonally. It flooded into the fields, watered their crops, and then went back, receded back in the Nile. And they were all, it was seasonal based upon the flooding rhythm of the Nile, not on how much rain had fallen. So their crops wasn't dependent upon rain. Obviously, there's not enough rain in the entire region of the world that the Nile would be low and may not flood, but that's what happened. But it's still, to this day, it still has seasonal flooding in the Nile. It's changed because they have dams and things like that at places in the Nile, which has created other problems. But they wouldn't be prepared for famine because it just didn't happen in Egypt. They didn't have issues with famine because of the Nile. Thanks, Jacqueline. All right, then here we go. Now, the elevation of Joseph. This is some of the most historically accurate details of the story, is what Pharaoh did to him. Was he had given him a ring, robes, gold chains, and then chariots. All right. And then a public guard, like Secret Servicemen, that would say make way, that would clear out the people. Whenever somebody was in a position of authority, these are the things that were given to them. The ring, you know what the ring is for? Does anybody want to guess what the ring is for?
To stamp the mail.
Who said to stamp the mail? I couldn't see who said that.
Holly. Holly.
Yeah, they would stamp any document. It's not necessarily mail, any document that came through. But any business transaction from the Pharaoh, he could validate what was being done with a stamp from that ring into a wax or a putty or something like that. So whatever was decreed by him, he had the right of the Pharaoh to do that. That's one of those historical details that's really important. If he didn't have the ring, he could not have led the nation the way he did. He had to have that ring so that his orders were held. He couldn't go around the entire nation of Egypt and collect 1/5 of the grain, nor could he just determine when it was going to be given out. he couldn't be everywhere. So he had to delegate men to do those things, and those delegations would have come in orders that would have been sealed with the ring. So he would have been doing business in Pharaoh's name. And then he's given a gold chain, which is status. And then what else is he given? Kevin.
Well, he's in charge of everybody except for the Pharaoh.
Right, he is. What item is he given though?
Chariot?
He's given a chariot that's like it's like a limousine of the day. He's going to be carried around in style. Something else. What? You're muted, Judy. Julie. You're still muted. I can't.
Hit Alt plus A.
There we go.
His daughter. Did Pharaoh give him his daughter?
No, gave him the daughter of the priest of On, which is the daughter of an extremely high.
Okay, because that's what I'm reading in 45.
I'm looking for an item here that just seems to come up over and over in Joseph's life.
A robe?
A robe. Yeah. There we go. Now, significance of the robe. What do you guys think the significance would be of the robe?
His ability to interpret dreams.
He's definitely got that ability, but more people would have this an expensive robe than just him, and not just dream interpreters. It is a status symbol. It is rank. Okay. Now think about Joseph's other robes. The robes that had status that said you were in charge of other people were either they're longer than a normal robe. They don't come to the knees. They go further down towards your ankles, past your knees, instead of a short robe. They would be long sleeved as well normally. Now, we don't know all the details of Joseph's first robe. We know that it's in his special robe, right? And his brothers resented the robe. Why do you think they would have resented that robe?
They don't want the younger sibling to be pregnant.
Because it says he was loved
Well,
more
his
than.
father gave him to Jacob gave it to him as a status symbol, but he was going to be over all of his brothers.
That is the status symbol. The robe isn't just the favoritism of Jacob. It also says the younger brother, and at the time, the youngest brother is going to be in charge of all his older brothers. Now, how often does that go over real well? It doesn't, right? And I remember as being an oldest brother in my family, I just could not let my little brothers do anything better than me as we were growing up. I mean, I had to beat them at everything and show them physically sometimes. So and even when I got older, so when I went to seminary, we had this, it was the very opening of school at Liberty, and it was the 25th anniversary, and now they're like, it's their 50th anniversary of opening of the school, starting of Liberty University, and it's amazing that much time has gone by. But to celebrate the 25th anniversary, they had in the parking lot for all of the student body these inflatables. And inflatables in 1995, 6, right around 95, was new. You know, there wasn't people all over. They were new. There was like 15 or 20 of these inflatables. And my brother had visited. I think he might have just come out of the Navy, or he was in the Navy, but he came up from Maine. He visited me and stayed with Mindy and I, and we all went together. And we're playing on all these inflatables. And there was one that was a bounce house with boxing gloves, inflatable boxing gloves. My younger brother was faster than me, but I just could not let him beat me. I just felt so, I finally just tackled him and just started pummeling him. I totally cheated because I could not stand having my younger brother just like, pow, like, I get so mad. So anyway, I think that especially younger, when you're older, it's not that big a deal. But when you're younger, having your younger brother over you in anything is always going to create intense animosity. And so the robe was not just something that was pretty. It wasn't something that was like a really nice piece of clothing. It would have symbolized status. Think about the second robe that he had. What was that one?
Given to him by the king.
No, there's one between.
Oh.
Potiphar gave him a robe, right? And that robe got him in trouble because, remember, she claimed that probably was also a robe indicating status. So he had status with it from his dad, that he was going to be ruling over his brothers or leading them, like an admin position. He's not going to be a normal shepherd. He's going to control the shepherds. And that's why he's sending him out to give reports all the time, not just to get him to be a tattletale. He's supposed to be in management. So then he goes into Potiphar's house and he rises through the ranks of slaves, and he's in charge of everything. It makes sense he would have a robe that indicate the same status. And then when he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man, a robe. Now this one's not going to get him in trouble, but that robe gives him status. He is now management of the highest order. The gold chain would be a symbol of even, higher status than the robe. So that's what those robes are. We don't want to get caught up on what they look like, but definitely want to look at the robe as something that's important. Now, I know Jacqueline's seen this movie. Jacqueline, you might want to step into this if you want, because you've seen the second one as well. There is a documentary that's really, really good called Patterns of Evidence. Jacqueline, you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, it was a fantastic film, and it talks about.
Go for it. Promote the movie.
It talks about Joseph, even though it says it's Patterns of Evidence.
I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me?
You can hear? I can't. Okay.
Here. Okay, let's try this way. So even though it's called Patterns of Evidence Exodus, it seems to be mainly about Joseph, the first two movies. In there, they discover the history of the Egyptian pharaohs that seemed to line up with Joseph, where there was this period of time where the majority of the wealth was with the farmers and that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden something happens that causes the pharaoh to become owner of all of the land in one generation. And so what it was probably that Joseph collected all that grain, and then everybody started to starve. And then in order to get grain back, they had to give over their land to Pharaoh in order to get that back. And then it also goes on from there. In the next film, it talks about the writing and how writing came about. And a lot of history says that Phoenicians are the beginning alphabet, which is a Semitic language, which is, the language of it would have been the language of the Hebrews and the Canaanites and all that kind of thing. But they go on to do a lot to prove that quite possibly written language came from Joseph, and from him having dreams and visions and understanding from the Lord as to how to create a phonetic understanding of language. So it's a really amazing one. And there's a third one out now. I don't know if you knew that, Rick. And that one actually starts to talk about the Exodus, finally.
But it's such a good movie because it'll have critics and it'll have scholars that are looking at saying the time that scholars has pinpointed the time that Joseph and the Exodus, from Joseph all the way to the Exodus took place. They say there's no evidence that it ever happened. But there's tons of evidence. They just said it's a couple centuries off. It's a couple hundred years removed from the time that supposedly it happened in the Bible. But all of the things that the Bible describes, there's evidence that it happens just centuries apart. But then he explains how they could have actually happened all at the same time. And it just seems like there's a resistance to those who want to believe that it actually happened at the same time. But the evidence is there. It's pretty astounding. And one of the ones I really liked is there is, in the middle of the Semitic community that they have done archaeology, there's one bigger house than all the other ones, and there's a statue of somebody that looks like they have a fancy coat on. And that's why, one of the reasons why I brought this up, that this coat, so they're putting two and two together. This looks like it probably was Joseph's home. And there are like 11 houses around it or something like that. I can't remember. But there's just a tremendous amount. You will like the movie if you watch it. Patterns of Evidence. I haven't watched the second one. It used to be on Netflix, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was on Netflix for a while. I know that, you know what, give me a second because I know they've been showing them recently again.
I'm looking it up right now, so she'll tell us where it's at right now. So she's looking it up. She's our Google person. But yeah, and then look up the second one too and see when that might be streaming as well. But if you get a chance to see it, it's outstanding. Any questions through what I've shared so far?
So we have the first two videos.
Oh, do you? Okay. I don't know if we can Zoom those.
Yeah, I don't think I could Zoom it from just having the video, but you can stream them.
I was kidding. I know we can't.
We cut that copyright license out. We can no longer show any videos, any movies.
Yeah. Is it already expired though?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. It's an awesome movie though.
I'm not really finding any luck for streaming on my go-to app that I usually use, but I'll keep looking.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody? All right. The next thing I want to talk about is, this is really awesome. The meeting with the brothers. So the brothers are sent by Jacob because they don't have enough food, and he hears there's food in Egypt. So he sends the brothers down to buy grain, and he sends everybody but Benjamin. And he's not sending Benjamin because he already lost Joseph, and he doesn't want to lose Rachel's other son that was born to him. So right away, Joseph accused them of being spies. And what it looks like, okay, so I'd like to say, when you guys read that whole thing of Joseph and the way he's treating his brothers in that whole thing, why do you think he was treating them that way? Instead of either just going out and say, throw them all in prison, they're my brothers, or make them slaves, or why does he reveal who he is? Why does he play this game with putting the silver back in their packs and make him bring the younger brother and put the cup in? Does anybody have any ideas? What does it seem like is going on to you?
To test their integrity?
That's what else could be there?
Just to see if they learned anything from what they did to him and if they've changed. And he seems to be like the wisest of all the brothers. So it would make sense that he has the intuition to set them up and allow them the chance to show if
They've changed.
learning from what they did to him.
Anybody else have any ideas of what's going on here? Chris?
If he can manipulate them into going back to their father or doing something that'll get Joseph or Isaac there.
You mean Jacob, his father?
Jacob, yeah. Distracted for a second. He can get, it would be a method that he could use to do that. It's kind of manipulative, but it would, if he just outright did something to them or accused them and turned them away or something, then it would be harder for him to get back into the family.
It could be. It's interesting that I always thought, it always seemed to me like Joseph was being petty, I mean, it's not petty in a way. I mean, he was justified for being upset, but it just seemed like he was torn between wanting to pay them back for what they did and not do that. And so, because it just seems like some convoluted thing. So all of you guys that shared are actually, I think, right in what's going on. a test to their integrity. Have they really changed? And what it's like to reunite with his own father. So look at what happens.
Can I say something about that really fast, Rick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually think so. I more align with what Chris says, because if like think about when they like what they did with him when they were like, okay, we made father think he's dead. Now we have to sell him into slavery because we're gonna get in trouble. Like if he had flat out accused them, there's a chance that they would have just run away from him because they would have feared that they would be punished by their father had their father figured out. So I think some of it too is like he was feeling like, well, I don't want to confront them right away. They may try and mistreat me or may try and just get away from me because they fear me. But because they don't know who I am, I want to get my father to me without them fearing like that I'm going to make, dad mad at them, basically.
I think that all of those answers are probably true to various points. I think they're all very similar things that could be going. There could be multiple motivations for doing these things. But one of the things I think about is actually just see whether they've changed. Just because of the details of the way things happen, you can see why this could be. Did I miss a joke there, Mike? He's muted.
No, Daniel's playing around us and it whipping all over the place, and
I got it.
We suddenly had a tunnel over our computer.
It's one of the disadvantages of seeing everybody that is on Zoom and seeing a reaction. You don't know if it's something somebody said or whether it's something going on in your own house. But so let's go through. So did somebody else say something? Yeah, Kevin?
I wonder also, though, if he didn't think that maybe he would get more honest answers from them about what was going on, where they lived with their father, brothers or whatever, to kind of get caught up, thinking that they might answer him more honestly if they didn't know it was Joseph, because you're right, they'd have been afraid of him because of what they did to him, especially seeing the position he's in now.
Yeah. It is interesting too that right away, that dream, I think this is really interesting because the dream is that he's going to see all these people bow to him, right? His brothers, his stalk of grain goes right up, and 11 just bow before him. Well, 10 of the 11 are laying there on the ground right in front of it. And even though he has a dream that predicts that moment, and he thinks it's a great dream when he's 17, right? He thinks this is an awesome dream. He doesn't know that in order to get to the place where they actually bow over, he's got to go to hell and back in order to see that all happen. He doesn't know. It's just a dream that says he's going to be over all his brothers. He thinks he's going to be, in charge of the family business. And it's much more. And he has to go through an awful lot to get there. So here's what happens. So look at this. The first thing is when they come, and we don't know why, but he chooses Simeon and puts him in prison, right? And says, until you bring back the youngest brother that you say, I won't know that you're really being honest. So I'm going to keep one as a prisoner. So it could be like the first test is that they just going to abandon another brother like they abandoned me, right? Because they didn't have a problem with him being and he gets a taste of prison, which Joseph was in prison. Then the second thing is they bring Benjamin back, all right? And so when Benjamin comes back, they come and they're scared for a couple of reasons. One is they have to say, okay, we didn't take our silver back. It was just in our packs. Voila, we want to give the silver back to you, and we want to give you this new bunch of silver so that our conscience is clear, that you can see that we didn't steal this. And immediately they're asked to go to Pharaoh's house, and they're uncomfortable with this. Like, what's up? What's he going to do? Right? And the servant says, don't worry about it. Your God has everything taken care of, which is interesting that they would point it out about their God, that everything's fine. So they bring Benjamin back, right? And when this stuff is going on, he overhears them feeling like they're in trouble because of what they did to him. But they don't know, because he's using a translator, that he can understand. So he knows that for the however many years it would be, he was 17, he was 30 when he's elevated, so he's 30, it's 2 years into the famine, so at least 2 years because this is his second trip. So you're looking at 15 years later, 15 to 17 years later, you're looking at they are still oppressed by what they did. So it's not like they didn't think it was a big deal. He can tell that it's a big deal to them, right? And Reuben saying, didn't I tell you not to do this to our brother? It's your fault. You know, he's trying to own up to, you know, he's trying to say it. But at any rate, they think it's guilty. Now, when they go back to go get Benjamin, it is Judah that convinces Jacob to release Benjamin and let him go. And he says something really interesting. He says, what? Take my sons as your own. The guilt will fall on me, right? Reuben tries as well, but Jacob doesn't listen to Reuben, right? So now remember when Joseph was sold into slavery, Reuben said, don't do this, let's throw him into the pit. Judah's the one said, hey, let's sell him as a slave. Each one of Judah's speeches get longer, by the way. The first one's really short. Why? He is our brother after all. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him as a slave. So Judah's idea, the first one, and all the brothers do what Judah says, right? Then Judah is the one that convinces the father to release Benjamin to go to Egypt, and it's his sons that he's willing to put in place. Now, think of this. Judah is the one that inherits the blessing through which David comes and eventually Jesus, right? But you see Judah arising as a leader of the brothers in these passages, all right? And we'll get that when we get to those blessings at the end. But the other thing that happens is that he, rather than see his father fear of losing another son, he is willing to take on the risk of losing his own sons. You see that? So he's willing to suffer like his father rather than have his father suffer more. Rather than his father lose 2 sons, he's willing to lose 2 sons. Then, once they get in and they say, don't worry about the silver, invites them to their home, they're worried about it. But Joseph is really keeping them off balance here because all of a sudden he seats them in birth order, right? And they're all shocked. Like, how did he know the oldest to the youngest? He'd know the youngest because they said the youngest is Benjamin, and they left him there and they brought him, right? And he brings Simeon back out. He seats them all in order, and they're like reeling. And he's keeping them off balance because he doesn't want them to lie to him. So they're like, this guy knows something. He's got some wicked powers, some abilities, right? And so he puts them in order, and then he feeds them. And then what does he do with Benjamin?
He gives him 5 times the amount that everybody else gets.
Right, 5 times the amount, right in front of the brothers, right? So he's going to see, do you treat my younger brother the same way you treated me? You see, because that's now the youngest son of the favored wife. Did you guys treat him as badly as you treated me? And I'm going to show favoritism to him, and then I'm going to sit back and watch and see whether you guys are treating him as badly as you treated me when my father showed me favoritism. You see? So he's putting them in a place where they can see, is the jealousy going to come back? Have they really changed? Now, I think the other things are going on as well. This is what, some of my research has been really eye-opening to me. So he serves them 5 times more. And then when he sends them out, he puts the cup in Benjamin's bag, right? This is the final test. So when they arrest them, they said, we'll all become your slaves. And the servant says, and Joseph says the same thing. Nope, the one who's guilty will be the slave. The rest of you guys can go, right? And so they still would rather, they would, what they're saying is they don't want Benjamin to be a slave, but they wanted Joseph to be a slave, right? So then when the servant rejects that, only the guilty will be enslaved. Joseph affirms only the guilty will be enslaved. And then Judah's third speech comes up and he says, I cannot bear watching my father suffer again. Take me as the slave, right? Make me the exchange. Make me pay the price for what you're going to punish my youngest brother for the benefit of my father. At that point, Judah was the one who said, let's sell him into slavery. And now Judah's not saying, oh, well, I guess we lose another brother to slavery. Let's go home with lunch, right? He sees that it is at that point when Judah says, take me, that he breaks down and releases everybody from the room and shows who he is. Yeah, Kevin.
But Judah, in essence, lied to Joseph again when he's talking to him. He says, please, my Lord, let your servant speak a word to my Lord. Do not be angry with your servant. One of the last things he said when he's talking about his dad, we have an aged father and there's a young son born to him in his old age. His brother's dead. He didn't know Joseph was dead.
No, he didn't, but he could have easily assumed that under the circumstances, the average lifespan at that time was 30 to 40 years. So Joseph could have been dead and he was a slave. There's a very good chance that he could have been, but he didn't know. So, but he definitely didn't come out and say, okay, what we did was we sold our brother into slavery. I'm coming clean. He didn't do that. But what he did do was say, don't take my youngest brother as a slave. I'll be the slave. That's what you see here. But you're right. He didn't just come out and say, I did this. And later on, it's like they're still worried about they're still worried that Joseph is going to pay retribution after their father dies, and they concoct a story to protect themselves that, their father said, don't, forgive them, don't do this to them. And Joseph's answer to them right after he reveals to them, do not be too hard on yourselves, right? That God did, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, right? And now here's the real question. If this is what God did God want to do this, or did he allow these things to happen and make them go towards his will? Where's God in this? Is God wanting Joseph to be a slave and wanting him to be in prison? Yeah, Kevin?
Well, he had to win the favor of Pharaoh somehow. I mean, he won the favor of Potiphar, and then he won the favor of the prison warden.
Right.
And then he won the favor of the cupbearer and the baker, even though the baker got his head cut off.
Yeah, I don't think he won his favor. I think he won his favor.
And when they brought him to Pharaoh after the cupbearer finally remembered him, Pharaoh, if you read this, Pharaoh didn't doubt him for a minute.
Right.
I mean, he must not have. He put him second in command.
No, and he didn't. But the thing is that was it God's plan for him to be in prison? Did God put him in a slavery, or did his brothers?
Well, it would seem to be. That's what happened.
I think God did it.
You think God?
Yeah, I think God did, because when a person is going to be God's servant, but has to be put into a place of high level, God has to put them through a lot of stuff, I think, a lot of times, to get us to a point of humility and a point where we can be ready to not be taken over by the power, by the money, by, all the things that are offered to us when we're put in those high positions. And so I think a lot of times God will take someone in that kind of situation and put them through a ton of hardships and strip them. Because, I mean, Joseph was a kid from a rich family with a whole bunch of, he had all kinds of privileges. I mean, he was the favorite son. He was in a rich family. He lived a fairly easy lifestyle, and he you could see he already had some sort of prophetic or spiritual ability with the dreams and that kind of stuff. And you could see he was kind of cocky because his brothers really didn't like him. And so I think God had to give him a little bit of humility. And that happened where he gave him humility through making him a slave. And then he went through Potiphar's household and learned how to be a good slave. And then God tested him by saying, all right, you've done everything right. And now I'm going to see, are you going to still stand for me, or are you going to curse me? And so he let him be falsely accused and be drugged down. And so then Joseph had to learn more humility and had to learn more patience and had to learn more about just serving the Lord with gladness versus being someone who is just, you know, a really great person who everybody just always lauded. And so he had to go through that humility and that hurt in order to prove himself to God, to be put into a position that he was put into, I think.
To prove himself to God is another question. Is like, wouldn't God really know judge the heart of a man without having to prove it already? Wouldn't God already know that?
Well, I don't think it was a matter about proving yourself. I think it's a matter of being put through it to be trained up into
Okay,
it.
that's a difference. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, because it could be trained. It could be training ground. Is it the only training ground God could use? So Judah and his brothers didn't do anything wrong. They were just cooperating with God's will, right?
I don't necessarily think that that's the case. You know, I mean, there could still be evil in Judah's heart, but as Joseph says, don't feel bad about it. I mean, God allowed you to go over to this because Joseph recognizes that if God didn't want these things to happen to him, that Judah wouldn't have necessarily been able to go through with it. You know, that Joseph really had the blessing of the Lord. And so, you know, he allowed Judah and the other guys to be taken over in their flesh, you know.
Right. I want to do something here. Go open up your Bibles to chapter 37. To chapter 37. And starting in verse 14. So he said to him, this is Jacob, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off to the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived in Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? And he replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved from here. The man answered, I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now, does that seem like an irrelevant detail? Why is that important? Why didn't he say that Joseph found him in Dothan?
What does the word Dothan mean?
I don't know. It's a location of where they were found. I didn't look that up. It didn't. In the research I did, it didn't put any significance in the name of Dothan. It was just the region where they were grazing their flocks.
Would it be because Jacob didn't know that they were there in Dothan? He thought they were someplace and they were somewhere else?
Well,
so that if he ever decided to go look for them, he wouldn't know where to exactly look.
Yeah, he wouldn't have necessarily looked. I don't think that that's a problem. They're always going to look for better fields to graze their sheep, and they would be moving around. They wouldn't necessarily send somebody back maybe to tell them. But here's what you're thinking here. If Joseph didn't bump into a man that told him that they went to Dothan, where would Joseph have gone?
To where his dad told him to go.
Well, he already went to where his dad told him to go at Shechem, and the brothers weren't there. So he's wandering around. If he can't find them, what do you think Joseph's next move is going to be?
Go back home.
Yeah, go back home, not to the place where he gets sold into slavery. So this detail is put in here. This is God is organizing these events. If God wanted to protect them from slavery and use another means to send Joseph to Egypt, he could have at this point, go home. I don't know where they are, Dad. You know, so then he's not a slave. He doesn't arrive to Egypt that way. He could have done this. So it begs the question, okay, and this is what's interesting is like, I think Jacqueline's right. What they did was evil. God knew that's what they were going to do, but they're still guilty. But it's still somehow a part of God's plan. And it is a part of his training. It is a part of, it is humility. Obviously, you're in a humble place if you're a slave, and you're in an extremely humble place if you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison, right? And humility, I think, is one of the lost values of Christian culture in America and the Western world. Humility just isn't as valuable as it needs to be. And if you get to Moses, the compliment God pays Moses, does anybody know what that is? I'm thinking Jacqueline probably knows.
I'm trying to remember. I think it does have to do with humility, but that he was a man who was humble before the Lord, but I don't remember exactly. I mean,
he was the most humble man in the world.
Okay,
the most humble man in the world. So when his sister and brothers criticizing him for marrying somebody who's not a Hebrew, God punishes her and says that he's the most humble man in the whole world. So anyway, so humility is tremendously valuable, but it's also just the management training. He has to manage a whole household, and he's managing a prison, and he's managing in hard circumstances, not when you have like the authority and the money to do what you want. He has no leverage with Potiphar except to make wise decisions and show that he's capable, right? So I think the humility is there, and the management things, getting him into a place where he's ready to take on management. Now, I think that one of the things that you have to take away from this is that we have to divorce ourselves from the heresy that being a good Christian is rewarded with a good life. All right? And you'll see this throughout the Bible. There are things in there that if you follow the Lord, God will bless you. Those are promises that happen in the nation of Israel, but they're not literally translated to all people, all times. Because Israel they were enslaved for 400 years, right? After this, we're going to get into it, right? And it goes through it really quick. If you're in the reading this week already, it's like bang, 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 400 years flies by, right? And the 80 years of Moses' life goes by really quick. It's 80 years. He's 80 years old when he confronts Pharaoh. So if you were an Israelite 200 years into a 400-year slavery, and God told Abraham, and I think he told Jacob, both of them, I don't know if he told Isaac, that they would be a father of a nation of more people than you could count, right? That's the blessing, right? And through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. That's the blessing of the Messiah. But out of out of all of their blessing, he said, but they will be enslaved for 400 years. So your father passes it down to you. You're a Jewish person. You've been slaves. Your people have been slaves for 200 years. Does it matter how hard you pray? You're still going to be a slave. You're going to die a slave because you still got 200 years left. Right? And that is God's plan. And it has to be God's plan because, and I'll probably bring this up again when we get into this to the church as a whole, is that in order for God to make Israel a unique nation of their own, they could not stay in Canaan. They were already marrying women who were not Hebrews. The boys were, right? Judah sends his son to marry a woman that's not Tamar, who's not sent off to Haran or anything else. They're marrying the women in the land. They're going to get absorbed. And with the rape of Deborah, they were going to unite with a whole town, a whole city. are they still unique in being Jewish if they just blend with another city and become two people, they're now one people? God's plan was that they would be a unique people and they would grow exponentially and be innumerable. So now he moves them to Egypt, and as slaves, they can't really meld into the Egyptian culture either. So they're growing exponentially, but they're still their own tribe, their own people, right? From which then when he does get ready, it takes 400 years for them to be big enough to be a nation that can take over the whole land of Canaan. But God protects them by making them slaves. His plan overrides the quality of their life, because his plan includes far more than making them a nation. They have to be a unique nation with a protected genealogy that goes through Judah and all the way through Perez and through Jesse and David and all the way to Jesus. Is that plan included 400 years of slavery. And Joseph has this life that he can say, totally get why God made me a slave and a prisoner, so that I could save many lives and administrate all the food in Egypt. But all those slaves for 400 years never got that, great bedtime story ending, right? Do you understand what you tracking with me right here? So when things go bad in your life, you may not know the reason why. Joseph didn't really, when he gives the reason to his brothers why not to be hard on themselves, his reason was, you meant it for evil, God meant it for good. For what purpose? What does he say?
So that many will be saved.
Many lives, the saving of many lives, right? So they have food and they live. Is that really what the main point of God's plan is, looking from our perspective? Because we have a whole lot more to look back on.
Well, I think if you think of it as being saved in multiple ways, one, many people were going to be saved from that famine, but then out of that was going to come this nation, because they came into Israel, or they came into Egypt, became a nation, and then were brought out through the Exodus, which was a defining moment for the Jewish people. And then out of that comes the Messiah.
Yeah, it also caused a whole bunch of death of a lot of people. A lot of those Egyptians died in that whole Exodus thing. But do you think that Joseph knew that that the saving of many lives would be including a savior that would save would offer salvation to all of humankind?
Depends upon how prophetic he was.
Even if you're really prophetic, like say you're a really great prophet, you still got to get the knowledge from the Lord. And I don't think it was given, because that grand of a prophecy you think might be recorded somewhere at that point, but it's really not.
Unless God tells him to keep his mouth shut. There's a lot of that in the Bible where God shows people things and then tells them not to say anything.
That may be true. It's reading it at face value. It looks like Joseph's perspective. It makes sense, because I was put in charge. I'm in the right place at the right time so that food can save many lives. That's what I think's actually going on. But when we have more knowledge than what Joseph does, because there's more history. Now he may have had a prophetic word that was only for him, that was never shared with anybody. But I don't know that God really needed to do that. And I don't think that all of those Hebrews that are enslaved for 400 years, they didn't get that kind of word, because when Moses came, it was like they didn't believe it. They didn't believe Moses was really going to free them. And when he did free them, they still want to go back home. They want to go back to Egypt. So they don't understand that what all this is unfolding is driving towards history, bringing all history to a place where the Messiah is born. And all of these fit together. And for us as individuals, I know that God loves you as individuals, but God's plan means putting his individuals in the best place for his plan, maybe not be the best place for you. You see what I'm saying? And that's a hard pill to swallow for many people. Who else how many of you guys really struggle with that idea? Nobody struggles with it?
I mean, I know I've struggled with it in the sense of that there's times where it feels like I have to make choices about whether or not I'm going to do things that are beneficial to serving the kingdom or whether or not I'm going to do things that are beneficial for my personal life, because I know that if I would have made different decisions, I could have been a lot, further on in life. I could have had a lot more money, a lot more, I don't know, normalcy, I guess. I don't know.
Normalcy of American lifestyle is normal,
Yeah.
not history of the world. But yeah, normalcy to what we see, yes. And I've done that too. I've done and looked at, my life and said, wow, if I made other choices, we might actually have one new car in our life somewhere, it's like instead of all used cars or something, it just is a part of having Jesus as Lord, means he makes decisions. And we can actually question the decisions, but in the end of the day, it is about his decisions, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's what's best for me. And you have to get to a place, if Jesus is your Lord, that means that's what that means, is he calls the shots, whether it's good for me or not. Now, I will tell you this. Every decision that you make where you are saying yes to Jesus Christ, I'll do, even if it gets you killed. Doesn't matter what the end result is or make you live in poverty or whatever it is still going to benefit you personally. But maybe, and a good chance that it won't in this life. And that's why Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and rust destroy and thieves break in to steal, but bank it in heaven. Sacrifice what you have on earth, because whatever you store in heaven cannot be destroyed. It will be your reward, and it will be worth it. Now, when I was in high school, because my daughter just graduates, every time somebody graduates, it reminds me of when I graduated from high school. And you go to those award ceremonies, and all these kids that wrote essays and got high grades and did really well on their SATs. Actually, it was ACT for me back then. I had lots of regret, saying I should have tried harder. I should have done more. If I knew, especially my freshman year of college, how hungry I was going to be and how hard it was when everybody had money but me. I mean, I had like no money. And I was a hedonistic person at the time. So I always go out to drink when it was quarter draws for beer, because I couldn't afford any other beer. And I had all these other friends, they had money all the time. I just did it. And a lot of them were smart and they did really well in school. And I just wished I could have gone backwards and done it over. And I always think about that when I think about the end of my life and facing Jesus Christ, is you can't do that over either. You only have right now going forward. And if Jesus wants you to make choices you don't like, you've got to come face to face with the fact that he wants you to make them, and that the blessings come later. But you won't die in heaven and say, man, I wish I would have made more money when I was alive. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be, man, I should have taken that management position. I could have provided the kids with so much better education or so much more stuff, or, better music lessons or dance lessons or soccer lessons or whatever. Sorry, not picking on you, Jody. I squeeze soccer in there. Whatever it is, we want what's best for our kids, but understand that sometimes what's best for our kids isn't necessarily what's best for our kids. And it's a really hard thing to do. But the thing is that to organize your life around trying to find out, God, what is your will? Am I just going along with things because they're logical and they make sense and they're good for me? Or other times I have to make really hard decisions because that's what you want, but it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. It's not going to be what I want, but it's what God wants. I'm going to trust him. And then I believe the payoff is going to be there. And the more you're in love with Jesus Christ, the more you just want to do it just because it pleases him, whether you get rewards or not, So any other thoughts or questions on the Joseph story? Because I'm going to get a little bit into the blessings here once we're past here. Kevin.
Yep. It would be chapter 45 where he makes himself known to his brothers.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Pharaoh had Joseph give him carts and donkeys loaded up with stuff, and he gave them clothes. But even Pharaoh gave Benjamin 30 shekels of silver and then 5 outfits of clothes that the other guys didn't get. But it starts in verse 21, chapter 45.
Is it Pharaoh gave it to him, or is it Joseph gave it?
So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts as Pharaoh had commanded. And Pharaoh's the one, and I think Joseph gave them stuff too. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes.
Yep.
And then of course he sends the donkeys, everything to his father.
Right.
Verse 24. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way."
Right.
What is the purpose of that? Because of what he gave to Benjamin, and he didn't want a repeat performance of what happened to him?
Well, let's think about this. What do you think the brothers would be feeling now they realize Joseph is alive and now they got to go see Dad?
Well, I think what they're feeling now is that, and it doesn't really say in this, but for 15 years, they had to live with the guilt of selling their brother and telling their dad that Joseph was dead. And so now I'm sure that there's going to be some comeuppance as well when they go back to Jacob and say, "Oh, hey, by the way, guess what? Joseph's alive."
I've got some good news and some bad news.
Yeah. Good news, we got a bunch of food and some new clothes, and the bad news is
The good news, Joseph is alive. The
yeah,
bad
right. Yeah. I had it backwards. So
Yeah, no. The good news is he's alive. The bad news is we made him.
now we got to admit something to you.
Yeah. So can you imagine the brothers going back and say, "Reuben said I didn't do this. It's all on you guys. You know, I put him in a pit so we could get him back later, and you guys sold him as slaves before I got back to rescue him. It's all your fault."
So this statement, "Don't quarrel on the way," does that mean, listen, it's time to fess up to what you did?
It could be, or it could just mean that don't go home arguing about this all the way home. Just get home, bring my dad back. I don't care what you do. Just don't mess this up. I don't know. But I think there could be easily a lot of arguing along the way. They're siblings, for crying out loud. You know, it's like, I know I say this a lot if you haven't heard it, but I love Tim Allen's definition of sibling rivalry. Having more than one kid. You know, because he said, you know, because his wife asked me, "You know what causes it, don't you?" He goes, "Yeah, having more than one kid." That's what causes sibling rivalry. We got 12. There's a lot of sibling rivalry going on. So, anybody else have a question or thought they want to share?
I do have something to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
I looked up the word Dothan,
Yeah.
and it means 2 wells, but it also means a decree, something being established to send out. So, which I thought was interesting, because I thought that in a way that could have been the God sending Joseph out as a decree, basically, to what he was about to do. But
It's definitely possible. And when I brought up that, I don't know that that's the specific reason it's concluded. When you read verses that just seem like it's some throw-off story that doesn't mean anything, it does mean something. We just may not be able to figure it out, but there's a reason it's there. And so it's not just some little irrelevant, but I read it that way. If I had like one of the commentaries I read that pointed it out, I just kind of like threw that off as kind of irrelevant information, wasn't important, and I just kind of blew by it. If it wasn't for the commentary that pointed out to me, I wouldn't have paid any attention to it. So,
you know, it makes me almost wonder if when Joseph was saying, you know, don't feel bad about what happened, the Lord decreed, the Lord Dothaned this.
could be.
It just, I mean, it could totally not.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it is. It is. it's just hard to know exactly what some of these things are. And I think that there's a ton in scriptures that we're not going to be able to see till later, just like the Jews didn't see everything, all the scriptures prophesying about Jesus when he came, but we can see it. I think there's a whole lot of the scriptures point to our time that we just don't see, but other people, either on the other side of the, Jesus comes back, we'll be like, man, we were so stupid. Or our great grandchildren will look back and say, wow, how did they miss all this? Well, it's because you're living on a different side of history of historical events. All right, let's look at the blessing. So Joseph's dad comes back. There's definitely, let me see here. I want to look at my notes here for a second. Well, let's just go to the blessings here. I don't know that I have many notes on it, but I want to just mention a couple of things. You have some reoccurrences and stuff. So Jacob's going to die. And so just like his father, who was going to give a blessing to Esau, right? And he swindled the blessing away. This is a ceremony. All right. So this is something that's important in that culture. At the end of your life, you're saying something about each kid. Not all of them are blessings. Okay. And not all of them are prophetic. Okay. Some of this is he recognizes each one of his sons is a tribe, and he's giving them the land he wants them to have in the land of Canaan when he goes back. And you see this, that none of the individuals are going to be the land. It's each individual as representing a future tribe. All right. And the first thing comes up, and he calls Joseph first up, and Joseph, he brings his two sons, and he's going to bless the two sons, and he adopts Joseph's two sons as his own, and they become two separate tribes, and their inheritance is each 1/12 of all the land. They get one portion of the land, each of them, right? So now when you look at, remember what I told you, do you guys remember what's the difference? I'm gonna see if somebody else besides Jacqueline knows this. What's the difference between the birthright and the blessing?
Extra portion.
Right. The birthright's the extra portion. So you have 4 wives, right? And the one that is Jacob's favorite is Rachel. And she has 2 sons, right? The oldest of those 2 sons gets 2 portions. He doesn't give it to the 2 portions to the oldest of the other sons. Doesn't happen. It's going to be of Rachel's children. Now, if you look at Abraham, he had how many sons? Lots. Okay, just lots of sons, right? But he had one before he had Isaac, right? But who gets the blessing? Isaac, the son of his wife, his favorite wife. Not any of the other women, his favorite wife. So Jacob does the same thing, and he takes those 2 sons to get a double inheritance. So Joseph is essentially getting the birthright of I get twice as, so you divide everything up 13 ways, he gets 2 portions of it, okay? Now, 2 tribes don't get very much land or any at all. He says Levi will be scattered and Simeon they'll be scattered because of why? You guys remember?
They killed all those people when their sister got raped.
They're violent men, so they're skipped over. And Reuben is not considered the oldest, so he loses his birthright. They wouldn't get the birthright anyway, but the blessing is interesting because the blessing falls all the way to the 4th son of Leah. Okay, so what happens is you have the birthright goes to Joseph, the blessing that followed of Abraham that goes all the way to the Messiah goes through Judah. Now you can look at Judah and say maybe he's not as deserving either. Look at some of the things he's done. He's got his daughter-in-law, Tamar. He ends up having children with them and all that mess. But it is interesting, the story of Judah, is that Judah, I think part of the heart change that happens in Judah is losing 2 sons. Okay, he is the responsible one for making the decision to sell Joseph into slavery and watch his father suffer the loss of a son. but he also loses 2 of his own children. Okay? 2 of his own children, and then he's afraid the 3rd one's going to be lost, and he protects the youngest son. So he goes to his father, we need to send Benjamin to Egypt because otherwise we're not going to get Simeon back and we can't get food. And I think he empathizes with his dad, who doesn't want to lose his youngest son, because Judah would have lost his youngest son. And then he has 2 more. He has the twins, right? Twins are really interesting in the whole story of Israel. So Judah is the one that ends up taking on the mantle of the blessing that goes all the way to Christ through him. All right, but the double portion goes to Joseph by adopting his 2 sons. All right, now when I just think it's like history repeats itself. It's so interesting that when Joseph brings the sons to his father, the right hand is the greater blessing, right? And he puts it on the younger child's head and switches his hands. And Joseph tries to stop him, and Joseph said, not stopping me. And his eyesight might be just as bad as his father's was when his father did this, but his father didn't recognize, even though God said the older will serve the younger, he puts priority on the younger over the older, and switches his hands up as well. And so that is what happens in those blessings. And then a lot of them are just the division of the land of Israel. The things that are interesting to me is that Reuben doesn't get anything because he defiled a wedding bed by spending the night with his father's concubine, and then he loses out on the blessing. And then you have Simeon and Levi, because of their violence, they miss out. And you look at what does happen. This is where it is prophetic. Is Levi is scattered through Israel. They don't have any land. They're a tribe, but they're a tribe of priests, which turns out to be a blessing because they're a pretty significant tribe, but they don't have any land. They have some cities. And then you have Simeon, who's scattered in Judea. They don't really have a significant land. They kind of get a raw deal out of all the other ones. And then for whatever reason, there's a lot of speculation why Dan actually disappears. By the time you get to Revelation, there is no recollection of Dan when they recall the 12 tribes. But their land, they abandon the land they are supposed to inherit and go up north, and then they disappear from history eventually. Quick question. What do you think, which part of Joseph's life do you think is the most important? This is kind of go along with some of the things I said here before, but Joseph's youth, his period as a slave, his period as a prisoner, or the leader of Egypt? What's most important?
I would say the time that he was in control in Egypt, because it wasn't just his brothers and his father's family that he helped. I mean, if you read what Pharaoh said before he gave him all that authority, he pretty much told Joseph, because of the blessing that God had given him to be able to, or at least, get the words of God to interpret the dreams, that he was going to take care, that Pharaoh knew that he was going to take care of all the people around, because it wasn't just his family that he gave food to, but all the Egyptians got food, and they also sold food to surrounding countries as well.
Right. And it might seem that way, that the most important part of his life would have been is the ending, where he's the leader of Egypt. Does anybody else have a different point of view? Make sure I don't miss anybody here. I think this is really important to understand. There's not one part more important than the other. They're all super important, because he wouldn't have been that leader if it wasn't for all the time as a youth where he's kind of given some leadership, or whether he's a slave, or whether he's in prison. All those things line up to get him to where he's going. And so much of our lives, we're living with some sort of end in mind, right? The end. is whatever we think it is. And for me, sometimes that end was overcoming some really difficult, sinful temptations of mine, where I struggled with lust, or, or there's times where I struggled with greed and didn't even know it. And I could pray and say, God, I want these things removed. I want to be holy. I want to be righteous before you, and I want it now. And it seems like God would want it now too. He's not happy with my sin, and I want to make it easy. I mean, I want to remove the temptation so I don't cave into temptation or whatever. But experiencing all of those things, your shortcomings, your places where you're really low, all of those things, you might see them as tragic parts of your life, but they're all super important in the story God is putting together, of which your life is a part. And that I think, I don't know if it's the world or if it's just America, but we live our lives with these goals that we're supposed to be at a certain place at a certain time in life with whatever the American dream is or your dream is. And it's not the end. It's the journey. It's everything from the beginning to the end. Before you were a Christian to the time you're a Christian, and everything after, God is patient to let his will grow in your life little by little. You're just supposed to continue to surrender and follow him through all of it. But we tend to diminish certain parts of our lives as not important or tragic and shouldn't have happened or anything else. But the tragedy is what shapes who you are. And God may have orchestrated those things for reasons. They did in Joseph's life, So then you think about it this way. It's like, if you think about the people that hurt you most in life, the ones where the most injustice is done to you, which we haven't suffered from being in prison because we're Christians or anything else. We're pretty minimal, but they still hurt, real deep hurts. If you see those events and those people as life-shaping events that God put you in for a reason to help make you the person he needs you to be when your unique roles come into play, how do we hold a grudge against the people that did that if God really orchestrated a lot of that? You understand what I'm saying? I mean, I talked about forgiveness. Was it last Sunday or the Sunday before? I can't remember. I think it was last Sunday, wasn't it? Yeah. Forgiveness is really important. Obviously, if God has forgiven us so much, then we need to forgive to the same degree. I mean, there's no way we can't forgive if we really understand how much we've been forgiven. But we can also embrace the past regardless of what people did to us, because it was part of what God wanted to do to make you who you are. And that journey is super important. It's really, really important. And you can be thankful for it. So Joseph could literally go to his brothers and say, do not be too hardy on yourselves. All of this needed to happen. It was really important. And I embraced all of it. The slavery, the time I tried to get out of prison, but God didn't let me out anyway. I had to stay in there 2 more years. All of it's important. And we have to understand that journey is just as important as the destination at the end. That God has given you a life to lead, and he's got orchestrated some things he wants to happen. It is important for us to cooperate and participate with whatever God wants to do in our lives up until that point, and recognize that he's the one maneuvering and guiding your life, even though you may not like where it's headed or where it's been. But if he's Lord, he's in charge. It's a part of it's the mystery of omniscience, that it's his sovereignty, that he's in control. All right. And then to think about this too. I wrote this down. All those who suffer without a happy ending, right? Because Joseph is the ultimate one we want to follow, that all of our suffering will work out for something good and eventually figure it out. It doesn't always happen, all right? But for those who don't have an happy ending, for those who finish in anonymity, that your story, the sacrifices you made, go down in no history. Nobody will recognize the sacrifices you've made. Nobody may notice the things that you've done. You have to understand that God never forgets, and he sees it all. He sees it all. And so we have to take our comfort in that, because for so much of my life, I ended up spending so much of my time trying to figure out how I could get the most out of this life that God has given me, thinking that's what he wanted me to do. And that's just where he had me at that time. But I remember realizing that the things I was chasing in life, success and admiration and, you know, people wanting to know how I do things so well or whatever, was trying to fill a need in me. And when I recognized it, I just like, oh, I didn't like being needy. And I don't know about, I think men and women are probably equally in this. How many of you guys like feeling needy? Raise your hands high. You love being needy. Nobody? Nobody likes being needy, right? But you recognize we're all really needy. And when God brings you to that place that you're needy, it just feels so, ugh, I don't want to be needy. And so I just prayed and said, God, I will give you every dream I have if you will just fill this neediness in me. And I remember listing some of my dreams. Some of them I'm embarrassed about, but they're ministry goals and things I dreamed about becoming somebody or something in ministry. And I gave them all up at that point. And there's many times I've had to re-give them up because there's times that my imagination can still dream up of. And sometimes it might be revenge. It might be things that you want somebody else to finally understand how much they hurt you and they get theirs or whatever. All those things, whatever it is that you think you need, let God be your need maker. And at the time, I thought he would give me something else that would fill those needs, not ever recognizing that the way those needs are filled is by relationship with Jesus Christ. The deeper that relationship is, the less I need anything else. And if you guys pay attention to the worship songs you sing, hymns, this is going on for centuries. They're telling the same story, that the things of earth grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace, right? If you look at the old hymns, you look at the contemporary things, everything, all for Jesus, I surrender, right? It is not the way we live. It is just the way we sing. It's because we're not at the place where Jesus is enough to be all I need. And so that's my prayer. Jesus, I don't know you well enough to be everything I need. But if you're everything I need, then everything else is on the go. I don't need anything. All the things of this earth go strangely dim because they don't need any needs anymore. That's where you want to go. That's why the pursuit of your own personal deep relationship with Jesus Christ is so important. Because then all of your other neediness is met in him. And you can rest. You can rest. And that's what, the writer of Hebrews is talking about, is the rest of God that we enter into is in a relationship with Christ. It is really important for you to take the time to really sequester time to be with Jesus, to get to know him better. Then you care about where the lostness of mankind, the injustices of others in around you, and less about what I need to accomplish or achieve or acquire. They all become more minimal, and you'll have a joy that's is not explained by the average person. Won't understand it. They won't understand it, but you will have it. But you have to pursue it with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. That's what we're supposed to do, and it's really important. All right. Now I just want to talk a little bit. I'm going to probably make a video, hopefully tomorrow, about the plans of the church